Hey everybody, it's Stephanie Henry. This is M3. I am going to do a mini lecture on the cell cycle. And just one caveat before we get started, this is my initial trial, so I have had no preparation or anything. It's just a quick dry run, so I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes. So here we go. Okay, so by the end of this mini lecture, my students should be able to understand what the cell cycle is, the major stages of the cell cycle, the substages within those major stages of the cell cycle, kind of a basic understanding of what happens in each of those stages, and then why the cell limits its size before it reproduces, and why in multicellular organisms we don't have lots of just big cells instead of many small cells. So I'm going to start out with what the cell cycle is. So basically, humans have several stages in their life. So you're born and you're an infant. And then you go from an infant to a baby, and then you go baby to toddlerhood, and then toddlerhood into preschooler, and then preschooler to school age kid, eventually become a preteen, teenage years or your adolescence, then your young adult, then middle age, and then your elderly. So kind of the same thing with cell cycle. Cell cycle is just the basic different stages of life stages of the cell. So there are two major stages of the cell. And when we're talking about the cell cycle in this particular instance, we are talking about eukaryotic cells. So they do have a nucleus. And the two major stages of the cell cycle are the interphase and the mitotic stage. And so interphase is generally in most cells the longest stage, and then the mitotic stage is a lot shorter in most cells. Now, there is one instance where the mitotic stage is a lot longer, and then as that is if you have a tumor or you have a cancerous cell, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But in interphase, the cell is basically growing, getting ready to divide, and duplicating its DNA. So there are three substages of interphase. They are G1, which stands for growth 1, S, which stands for the synthesis phase, and then G2, which stands for the growth phase 2. So in G1, basically the cell is just kind of performing all its functions like it normally would. It's getting bigger, it's making proteins, it's growing, it's metabolizing, all of those things it would normally do. And then at that stage, there is kind of a checkpoint, and the cell decides, am I going to go on? Or am I going to go into what's called GNOD? And so certain cells go into what's called GNOD, which means that they kind of just stay in the stage. The cells that do that are muscle cells and nerve cells. So if you damage those, they don't come back. Cells that go on to the S phase, and then in the S phase, of interphase, we're going to duplicate our DNA. And so that's why it's called synthesis, because we're going to duplicate our DNA so that we have the right amount of DNA when our cells divide. And then we're going to go on to G2. And in G2, we are going to start preparing proteins that are going to help us divide, in addition to growing and carrying out the normal cell functions, because there are some proteins that need to be created to make spindle fibers to help with the division of the cell. Okay, then we're done with interphase and we go into what's called the mitotic phase. The mitotic phase is basically where the cell is going to divide, and that's broken down into mitosis and what's called cytokinesis. So mitosis is where actually just the nucleus is dividing, and then cytokinesis is where the rest of the cell, the cytoplasm and all that kind of stuff divides. So mitosis is broken down into 4 stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And I'll talk more about those in a subsequent lecture. But basically an easy way to remember what comes first, second, third, and fourth is PMAT. If you can just remember the acronym PMAT for prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And basically at this point, all I want you to know is that the nucleus is dividing. But like I said, in subsequent lectures, we'll talk more specifically about what happens in each of those stages. And then once mitosis is done, we're going to go into what is called cytokinesis. And in cytokinesis, the cytoplasm is going to divide. And I should say, when we talk about mitosis, we're talking about our somatic or body cells. Our sex cells actually go through a stage called meiosis instead of mitosis, so it is slightly different. The next thing I wanted to talk about was cell size. So if you think of a multicellular organism, even a really big organism, like say an elephant, you'll notice that the elephant has lots of small cells instead of one really or a bunch of really big cells. And you might wonder, why is that? Why wouldn't it be more efficient to have fewer cells and have them bigger? And the reason has to do with the surface area to volume ratio. So the surface area you can think of is like the outside of the cell, the area that the outside of the cell takes up. And the volume you can think of as the inside of the cell, all the contents of the inside of the cell. So if you think about a balloon, for example, and we're blowing up the balloon, the surface area would be the outside of the balloon, and the volume would be the air inside. If you continue to blow and blow and blow air into the balloon, eventually what's going to happen to the balloon? It's going to pop. So that is one thing similar to the cell. If the cell would continue to get bigger, 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 the volume replicates a lot faster than the surface area does. So that could eventually happen. Another reason that we like to keep the cell smaller is because if you think of like a big business and you want to communicate in a big business compared to maybe a small business, it's a lot easier to say, yell across the room if you need some help. Say you don't have any telephones or anything like that, or intercoms or anything like that. It's going to be a lot easier to communicate, like if you just have to yell across the hallway or something, as to if you have this big, huge warehouse and you have to, scream like miles loud. So same thing, communication is a lot easier if the cell doesn't get too big. Also, travel. We have to transport things in the cells like proteins and various things like that. And so it's a lot easier to transport things in the cell if the cell doesn't become too big. So it becomes a lot simpler to do that. So just to kind of recap what we talked about the two major stages of the cell cycle. Those were interphase and mitosis. We talked about what the cell cycle was. And the cell cycle is basically the life cycle of a cell. We talked about substages of interphase and mitosis, or the mitotic phase. And substages of interphase were G1, S, and G2. G1, the cell grows. S, the cell duplicates its DNA. G2, we start making proteins to get ready to divide the nucleus. Mitosis and cytokinesis are part of the mitotic phase. This is generally a lot shorter phase unless we have cancer. And so the nucleus is going to divide in mitosis, and then the rest of the cell is going to divide in cytokinesis. And then we talked about the reason that cells stay fairly small. And we said it was for several different reasons. For one, this volume, because as the cell gets bigger, the volume gets bigger a lot faster than the surface area does. It's also easier for communication if the cell stays smaller, and also transportation. So hopefully that helps. And we'll try this again once I've had some preparation and see if I can do a little bit better with this. Thank you.